Peter already. The panel discussion, or more of a fireside chat. I'm hoping these three are going to quiz each other. I've got a few questions. I'm sure there'll be a few questions from the audience as well. But we have with us Dr. Gillian Izzadar-Adi. Now, is it Izzo-Adi or is it Izzo-Adi? Gillian?
Izzo-Adi. You're right.
Izzo.
That's
Izzo. That's what I thought. And then I got nervous at the last minute. Lighting scientist with Light Naturally. She has a PhD in optical physics and over the last 15 years has been conducting research into a range of topics in lighting, daylighting and photometry. And her recent research projects include daylight glare assessment in green buildings, the application of LED street lighting for road safety and driver performance, and a study on the impact of light at night from street lighting sources. And rounding out our panel, we have Wendy Davis, who is the Associate Professor in Lighting, Director of Illumination Design at the University of Sydney in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning. And she leads the Lighting Design Masters Program and a research group investigating ways that emerging technologies can be used to better illuminate architectural spaces. And emerging technologies, I think, is going to be one of the little topics that we focus in on. So welcome all. Gillian, what are you working on at the moment?
Well, that's a good question. There's a few things I'm working on. I'm still involved.
I am top secret probably, but carry on.
No, nothing top secret. I work at Light Naturally. I used to work at QUT in Brisbane, and I'm still involved with some students who are completing research projects and also some linkage projects at QUT as well. So one of those that's wrapping up shortly is a fairly large study on visual comfort, daylight and glare in offices. But we also have some students who are doing very interesting work on things like use of blinds. In open plan spaces, how people use daylighting systems in a collaborative environment and the types of users and what makes them make decisions on how they use the space. I'm also doing some work with students on design of daylighting systems and measurement of glare. I'm doing a bit of work as well on LED street lighting and dimming and driver performance under different dimmed street lighting conditions, including comparing dimmed LED conditions with conventional street lighting arrangements like high pressure sodium.
And have you been working from home or lockdown? Or
I've been working from home, but I often work from home actually in the work that I do now. So it hasn't been a lot of change for me. Yeah.
Cool.
I just have more
Wendy.
people in my home office now.
I see. Wendy, what's exciting you at the moment in your work? What are you thrilled about?
Yeah, the thing I'm probably most excited about is we've got a line of research that started a few years ago, but is on this idea of application efficacy. So the typical way that we sort of measure the energy efficiency of lighting is called luminous efficacy, and it's at a device level. So for a lighting product, a luminaire or something, it's about electricity in and light out. But for architectural lighting, we actually care about electricity in, but ultimately arriving at visual perception. And so there's a lot that happens between the light coming out of the luminaire and getting into our eye. And so some years ago, we did a number of experiments and sort of computational studies looking at how we could minimize the amount of light that gets absorbed within a space. Because a lot of light comes out of your fixture and gets absorbed by surfaces, then we can't see it. So why don't we just not do that? And that's been cool stuff that I'm really jazzed about. But we actually were just, like 2 weeks ago, awarded a grant from the Australian Research Council to do a series of experiments on what I'm affectionately calling gaze-dependent lighting. But this idea that we have the technology that we could absolutely develop lighting systems that can detect all the occupants in a space, detect the position of the head and the eyes and a few other things, and basically know where we're looking and just put the light where we're looking. So for any of us, it seems everybody's at home. I also am at home in a much sparser background. But if you have your electric lights on, there's undoubtedly some light that's, say, hitting the corner of a room or under your desk or places you're not looking. And that's also wasted light. So if we start thinking about the waste of light beyond just the device level, we have all of this potential to save energy, save the energy consumed by lighting through new design strategies, right? Because we've been really relying on technology to increase energy efficiency, but we've been designing spaces pretty much the same as we have with older technologies. So yeah, that's what I'm super jazzed about right now.
Fantastic. All right, I've got a couple of questions and I'm going to fire my first one at Peter, because I was intrigued that you came from a theatrical lighting background. I came from an entertainment and magic background. So, and one of the books I've got up on my bookshelf over there is this book from about 1890 called Theatrical Illusions and Stage Techniques. And it's got this whole chapter of lighting. And the question came up, has many innovations from the theatre side moved into then industrial and commercial lighting, or does it go both ways for, you know, lighting design, tools, whatever?
So it's very interesting. At least in the United States, there are kind of two groups of lighting designers. You have lighting designers that came from theater, which myself, and so we tend to think about things in terms of the aesthetics first and the technical second. And the other group is people that got their degree in electrical engineering. It's actually a very, very small number of people that get their degree in lighting design or architectural lighting design. So my degree actually was theatrical lighting design. But the difference is that, so theater people look at things aesthetically first and technical second, and more technical people look at things technical first and aesthetic second. So when you look at the different environments and how that kind of plays into it, I would say that in commercial lighting, it depends, because remember, commercial includes, you know, mundane office spaces and parking garages and industrial facilities, and it also includes hospitality environments and restaurants and retail spaces, right? So in retail and restaurants, I think that there's more of an influence because you're trying to create a scene, right? And it is about color and it's about effect and certainly making people look good. And when I do residential projects, it is also about making people look good, which is very, very similar to a stage environment where the actors have to look good, right? When I made the switch, let's say, from theatrical to architectural lighting, I always told people, look, it's the same thing. You know, in theater, you have a director and a scenic designer and a costume designer and a lighting designer and actors. Well, in the built environment, you have an architect and an interior designer and a contractor and an owner and people that are going to be in the space. And so it's the same thing. You just, I think that the most important thing that all of us from theater bring to it is collaborative thought. And that is something that I think is incredibly important. From a product standpoint, I think that what has changed is that when you look at themed environments, they've always had a theatrical element to them, but now with LEDs, I think that even homeowners are getting more and more, let's say, daring when it comes to things like color and adding things just for effect into their houses that they wouldn't have done before.
Cool. All right, let's take a peek into the future so our attendees can be warned about some of the disruptive trends or perhaps emerging technologies. Would Wendy or Gillian like to kind of jump in on that one? What's coming down the pike?
I have an observation that actually I wanted to ask Wendy a question
about.
about.
Yeah,
fire away. We were talking about offices of the future, and obviously in this context, one of the things that comes up is this idea of a touchless office. And I think when people think about controls and touchless controls for lighting, they think about the, you know, or light on, that sort of thing. I'm wondering, Wendy, do you see a role for a kind of an intuitive, a really sophisticated sort of sensing system that sort of follows users in a space and understands what they need Do you think that's possible? Do you think it's, and what sort of time frame do you think that sort of stuff is realizable?
Thanks, Jillian. I think it's super possible. I mean, it's definitely technically feasible. And time frame is a funny thing, because it actually sort of speaks to Timothy's question, which is that I see two potential futures. I see one that sort of mimics the last 15 years, which is that we make some incremental improvements in luminous efficacy and otherwise everything stays the same. I think that's kind of a bummer of a future, but I think it's entirely possible. One of the, I think, panelists, or maybe speaker, I think it was a panelist earlier, spoke about, in a slightly different context, race to the bottom. And if we look over the last 15 years, with the introduction of LEDs, certainly with regard to price, especially in that first decade, it was a race to the bottom, which meant it remained a commodity market. And that makes it really tricky to do really innovative, cool stuff that would cost more. So that's one sort of possibility, and it's a very distinct possibility. But my vision for the future, of course, is far more exciting. And I do think a lot of, I feel like smart lighting and smart buildings are a bit of buzzwords and can seem a little bit annoying. But when I imagine like the cool, radically different things that lighting can do, it does rely on that sort of that smartness, this automation that of course is, determined by a person at some point. It's not, the buildings aren't going to become alive. But, thinking about if we can, I spoke earlier about the idea, let's just put the light where we're looking. Let's tune the spectrum of the light so it doesn't get absorbed by surfaces. But also if we can track, say, a person through a building, we can monitor their own light exposure. And as their state of adaptation changes, for instance, when we're in quite dark environments, our visual system actually becomes more sensitive. And so when your visual system's more sensitive, you actually need less light. So we could be changing the light based on what is going on with the person through technology that absolutely exists and is used in other fields. Like there's no major engineering challenges. It's really sort of like a commercial kind of market. Is anybody going to be ballsy enough to try to sell it kind of a thing?
Cool.
I don't know if I'm allowed to say that.
That's all right. You can say whatever you like. Peter, thoughts on emerging technology, disruptors to the industry? Exciting things.
Yeah, it's interesting, but I agree with what you said, Wendy, about how we've reached somewhat of a threshold in terms of, let's say, efficacy of an LED, right? It's not going to become exponentially greater. We went through this phase where it was like, wow, here's a jump, and then another jump, and then another jump. Now it's gotten to a point where I think that people are getting comfortable with it, I actually really try to pay attention to normal consumers, right? Because in order to increase overall the kind of perceived value of lighting design and proper lighting, it has to become more mainstream, right? And it has to become something that normal consumers say, hey, lighting's really, really cool. I want to do that, right? So if you look at what is happening within consumer products now are all about, how do I control this light source? Can I do it through Amazon Alexa? Can I do it through Google? Can I do it through some sort of voice command? Can I do it through AI, right? They might not even know what AI is, but they're actually doing it. So when you look at what's happening with light sources and controls, people are actually like, wow, you mean so I can just change this and then I can control it through my phone, or I can say, hey, Alexa, turn my lights on? They actually find that to be interesting. And so what it's doing is it's kind of waking them up to the importance of lighting, which I actually think is a really, really good thing. When you look at the two other product groups that and again, in the United States, they're very popular. Things like Ring doorbells and Nest, which is your thermostat, and they're connected things. Well, people can put perceived value on safety, right? If you're able to look at your phone and get a notification that someone's at your front door, that's easy to sell, right? And if it is something like controlling your thermostat and saving money, then that's easy to wrap your head around. When it becomes, hey, I can, walk into my living room and say, Google, turn my lights on, or Amazon, Alexa, turn my lights on. That's a gimmick, right? But it's a gimmick that people are becoming more and more accustomed to, the fact that, hey, this is neat. And they're going to tell their friends, right? We're allegedly having Thanksgiving in a couple days, depending on where you are. And, people are going to be over. They might find that very interesting. You could say, hey, look what I can do. I can walk into this room and I can tell my Alexa to turn my lights on. And so that increases at least the awareness of what you can do with light, and certainly changing color, right? Whether that is tunable white lighting or imparting RGBW, those are fun things that people on a broad level of the public are starting to get interested in.
Cool. Any other disruptors we should be aware of that you'd like to throw in?
Well, I actually would like to ask Jillian a question that I think falls within the disruption category. I find that a lot of lighting designers, Australian-based lighting designers, are very concerned about liability. And to an extent that I think perhaps might be overkill, but whatever. And so when you talked about dimming streetlights, that's something that I think is super interesting, because of course we leave them on all night, or there's no one there most of the time. But I think the reaction of a lot of sort of rank and file working lighting professionals is like, oh my gosh, we're gonna get sued. So I'd like to hear about what you guys are finding.
Sure. Well, I mean, we have some preliminary work that we've done. And in terms of driver performance, some of the key measures we're looking at are things like recognition distance of pedestrians on the side of the road, detecting object movement, that sort of thing. I mean, in terms of liability, doing driving performance research is always a challenge, because you've obviously got to be very safe. So objects that move, not people necessarily to cross the road, but then just observing people as well, observer distance, reaction times, driver reaction times. And so in some of the early work that we did, we found that essentially, driver reaction times, we had 100%, 75%, 50%, 25% dimming levels, and there was little difference between 175. And then we started to notice some significant difference going down to 25%, and again, also to 50%. One of the most interesting things to me is that people, when we ask them after they've done their laps and ask them about the lighting, what they thought about the lighting, is that people don't seem to have a sense of any change really in the lighting levels throughout those levels. They noticed 25%. 25%, they're like, yeah, that's dimmer than I expected, or that's dimmer than normal. But 50%, 75%, they didn't feel that those levels affected their performance. So it's interesting, the difference between what people think lighting is doing for them and what it is doing for them. But what we found is that what we weren't able to do in that original study was compare with high pressure sodium. And of course, the very interesting thing to us is how do these levels perform against the baseline of what currently has been accepted as acceptable practice for lighting. So how performance changes when you get away from what's conventional lighting and what's currently accepted, and then looking at dimming compared to that's really where we're up to now, and we're looking for results from that. And we're also interested, because everyone's a little interested in things like, does glare, is there a glare situation that occurs uniquely from these sorts of lights, or is it a consistently uniform thing? Does that affect performance? Does color temperature affect perception, those sorts of things as well. So they're all things we're interested in. One of the things that I guess the key finding for me of most interest, or the most unusual finding for me, was that people aren't necessarily very good at predicting whether they're being furnished with a condition that is optimal for their performance. Do you understand what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. And in one of the earlier either keynote presentations or panels, there was sort of a discussion, I think actually, Timothy, you brought it up, the difference between safety and like the perception of safety, right? This idea that we, in order to feel safe, a lot of people need a lot more light than like to actually get around, fractions of a lux is usually really sufficient. It'll be interesting to see if the type of work you're doing, and presumably there are others in that field exploring similar things, can actually make change, like to actual practice.
Yeah, and look, it's really interesting from a sort of a historical perspective. There was never essentially a huge amount of groundwork that was laid out at the beginning of street lighting that said, this is what is safe. This is what is, and even then following up, I mean, all that really seen research and statistical research has seemed to confirm is that some light is generally better than no light. But that there's not really been a level that goes, this is where we have accepted the safety. So when you talk about liability, it's historical, the levels that are there now. So that is also of interest.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that applies to a lot of lighting standards. I mean, Australia is very sort of standards focused in lighting design practice. And a lot of people that use the standards have this idea that they're like, you know, meticulously researched and optimal, and you have to meet them. And it's like, if you read the documents, there are shockingly few citations in there. And if you participate in a standards sort of development process, you realize it's kind of a bunch of people sitting around a table being like, I think it should be 150 lux. I'm like, I think it should be 175. And we settle on 160.
Yeah.
I've actually got a question from the audience pretty much along that line. Mr. Anonymous, what international lighting control standard does the panel see as being implemented in Australia?
Jillian, you want to have a go?
No, you know what? I don't have a feel for that. Sorry.
I assume that they're talking about control protocol, like the language used for the control. And I also don't have a strong prediction for that. I mean, I would say based on my, and I'm an academic, based on my limited experience, I think kind of the most widely adopted right now is probably Dolly here. But as far as the future, yeah. Peter, how about in the US?
In the US, I mean, it is, well, in terms of controlling LEDs in particular, you know, we for the most part, try to stay away from 0 to 10 volt or Dolly, only because of the additional control wires that go along with it, but it also depends on the environment. So in commercial projects, it's not a big deal. In high-end residential projects, it's typically a big deal. But I would say it also has a direct effect on what it is that you're doing. So if it's anything that is tunable weight, for example, then we know that that's going to have additional control wiring, which is going to then make it Dolly or digitally addressable, or DMX, or 0 to 10 volt. So it's really kind of based on the needs of the fixture, the needs of the project. But I would say if there was a standard in the US, I would say the standard is don't add wires if you don't need to. So forward phase, reverse phase are still the two main ones. But I think it's an interesting thing because in Europe, for example, Dolly and 0 to 10 are completely normal. And nobody shies away from it, which is why when we get on a project and let's say the interior designer has specified a fixture from Europe, there's inherently dimming issues because they don't know to ask about the driver type. So in terms of what you guys are going to have, I hate to say it's usually whatever's the least expensive, but it's usually the least expensive.
Well, and I think actually your reference to Europe raises an important point, which is that a lot of the product norms here are a consequence of our voltage, which means it either comes from Europe or it comes from China.
Right.
And so, we've got two very standard residential bases. We've got the Edison base, and we've also got the bayonet base, and it's crapshoot in any given house as to which one's going to be. And I think a lot of what we end up with is really just an artifact of where the products tend to get imported from because of our mains voltage.
Right.
So yeah, we would probably look to China and Europe and make some predictions based on that.
Segues nicely into this next question. Can you see an update to the codes to better justify the use of quality light fittings rather than allowing the cheapest product to be used?
Does that, I'm wondering if that means building codes or just energy performance MEPS type codes? Because at a product level, I would say that for LED products, the government has indicated that they're looking to the EU regulations to do something similar or to something that's consistent with that. And I would imagine that that would have potential there to lift product quality. But if you're talking about like the building codes, then yes, I mean, I would say for commercial spaces, certainly as those codes get updated, that there's the lift generally in the requirements of energy density and that sort of thing, so that yes, better products need to be used, or more energy efficient products need to be used. Whether that's better, I mean, that's one dimension of product quality.
And related to that, I think there will always be a cheapest, right? Whatever the rules are, there will be cutoffs. There'll be the efficacy requirements or whatever else. But there will always be those cheap product lines that are trying to undercut everybody else and trying to do the off spec. And I personally think that looking for a legislative solution is probably, I mean, there's a history in Australia. There are a lot of these sort of industries that exist because of a legislative solution. Electrical testing and tagging is, I think, a great example. There is a law that keeps that in business. The fact that all renters have to have professional smoke detector inspections annually. That's a legislative thing that sort of keeps that in business. Not sure that it's the best way to win hearts and minds, but it's possible.
And in the US, I can tell you that, so we have a variety of different codes and standards, but in California with Title 24 and all the iterations of Title 24, it used to be specifically just efficiency, right? Well, now they have minimum standards for quality of fixtures in terms of, for example, the minimum CRI that they will accept now is 90. And that's a step in the right direction, because it used to be that even with something like Energy Star, my apologies to anybody who was employed by Energy Star, it used to be just, hey, use this because it consumes less energy, and you get a piece of junk, right? And the reality is that now it's gotten a little bit better, where they are concerned about quality of fixtures, so that, you know, let's face it, if somebody puts something into their house or into their business because they're being told that they have to, and they don't think it's any good, then they're going to take it out, right? So when you look at changing standards and implementing quality standards, I think it's a step in the right direction. But I always think that you have to take a look at analogies of other industries. So for example, you know, if you look at EPA standards, again in the US, but EPA standards about minimum miles per gallon for a vehicle, for a, you know, residential or personal vehicle. If that got to a point where, let's say, you know, you could only buy a truck if it was 40 miles a gallon, okay? And that meant that you were going to give up air conditioning and a radio. Nobody's going to do it, right? So there has to be some balance of what is expected with quality. And with lighting, I think that everything that we've seen happening here is that the quality standards of color, for example, and dimming levels, that is being written into energy code standards, which is, again, a step in the right direction.
Cool. I have one more question here from the audience, and we've probably got time to take another one if somebody wanted to type one in. From Toro, is there a standard lighting plan schedule which needs to be provided to architects, interior designers, e.g. including lux levels, calculation, distancing, etc.? Can you?
I would say it depends on the type of project. So when we do commercial projects, depending on the area that it is, you have to do different ISO foot candle plots. You have to do point-to-point calculations to show minimum required light levels maintained at certain areas. But it depends on the project. So like we don't have to do that when we do a restaurant. We don't have to do it typically when we do something like an amenity space in a hotel. But if it is a school or an office building or a medical facility, you have to do that. And certainly if it's a parking facility, you have to do that. But yeah, one thing I can say residentially is that there are certain towns in and around, for example, Boston, Massachusetts, where they have written into their building codes that when you do any exterior lighting at a residential property, you have to do point-by-point foot candle calculations to make sure that you don't have any light trespass going into your neighbor's property. And that actually, that photometric study has to be included in what is submitted for building permits, which is crazy. So that's an area where, you know, lighting designers are getting work just doing stupid busy work like that because it's not something that architects and interior designers know how to do. So it depends on the project, but I would say that it's probably shifting that way.
Yeah, so to be slightly more specific to Australia, just a note for anybody who's in the audience, a foot candle would be the American version of
sorry. Yes,
that's
sorry.
Okay. It would really depend on which standards you either chose or had to adhere to. So for most projects, forget it was recently renamed, but what used to be the Building Code of Australia applies because that's regulation, like you have to do that, as well as associated energy codes. So you would have to demonstrate adherence to that, and usually there are a series of calculations that would go with that. But certainly for outdoor spaces, as well as almost all kinds of commercial indoor spaces, Australia or Australia/New Zealand standards typically apply. And if the contract you have with whoever you're doing the design with says you have to adhere to all relevant standards, you have to find those. And you have to demonstrate those. So yeah, usually you would calculate illuminance, you would calculate illuminance uniformity. For outdoor lighting, there's a lot of stuff with like obtrusive light. So it's not super standard in that there's not like a template and it's like, if you just use this for all jobs, you're good to go. But if you start working in a local area, you learn really quite quickly what is expected.
All right. Well, looking at my clock, and that's the one that counts, it's we've just about run out of time. Any parting thoughts from you, Peter? A challenge for the attendees here. We've still got a great group listening, so they must be getting value. What's your challenge for our audience out there?
Just keep going, keep promoting the importance of lighting. It's something that I honestly feel that we are at such a great point of opportunity within the design and construction community that I honestly think that the whole field is going to take off like crazy within the next decade. I really, really feel that. So just keep working hard, keep letting people know that lighting's really important.
Thank you. Wendy, any last thoughts? A challenge?
I would just sort of make the point that often in a field like ours, it's easy to learn what I would call, and it's not meant to be as dismissive as it's going to sound, sort of a superficial approach to design, where you have a relationship. If I use this kind of product, I get this kind of outcome. And it's easy to just keep going like that. But as technology advances, we really have to understand things a little bit more deeply. So if you understand how that product works, how it, like physics-wise, how it produces light, what really is leading to the result that you're getting, then when things do change, you have really like the foundational knowledge that you can keep up. So I would just encourage people to get deeper whenever you can.
Excellent thought. Gillian?
Well, I would say in the context of, encouraging advancement in lighting profession and encouraging advancement in sort of technology and application of lighting, I think that going back to our discussion about the future of office lighting, we're sort of poised at the moment for maybe some transformation in that space. I mean, we're all here working from home and quite happily doing it. I mean, we just demonstrated it can be done. So now if we go to the office, you've got to give us a reason to get there, because this is pretty comfy for me, you know. And will design, and particularly lighting design, form a big part of that? I think it could. And I think that there could be a lot of sort of real change that is brought about by this reimagining, if you like, of what brings people to the office. Not just like from a, you know, human sort of centric, I guess, if you like, point of view, but also just from an aesthetic, like why would I go to that space when I have this very comfortable space here? You've got to make it worth my while. And it's also got to be safe again. So that sort of idea of how could a space know what I need lighting wise without me having to touch a button, or, you know, that would be great opportunities.
Fantastic. All right, we're going to have to wrap it up there, because I promised to send our delegates home or back to the office or wherever they are. Thank you, first of all, Peter, for staying up and adding an international perspective to this. And Wendy and Gillian, thank you for your input, lively discussion there. And